Hey, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our September Dalim Tips and Tricks webinar, which will be on rule sets. Probably the first of 2 or 3 webinars we're going to do on the subject, since there's a lot of information to cover. This is part of our GoToWebinar series. If you're new to GoToWebinar, there is a Zoom button in the upper left-hand corner of the main GoToWebinar window, where you can adjust the scaling of my screen if it's displaying too large or too small on your computer. There is in the main GoToWebinar control panel a questions area where you can type any questions that you might have. If there's anything particularly pertinent to a point I'm discussing, I may pause to address it. Otherwise, I typically go through those questions after the presentation. This is part of our monthly Dalim Tips and Tricks webinar series. We do one webinar the third Wednesday of each month. Typically, as soon as we know what we're going to be doing for the upcoming month, we'll put the information up on our website at blanchardsystems.com/events. So be sure to keep an eye there. As mentioned, we will be discussing rule sets today, just basically going over the basics. This is a very dense topic, and rather than trying to cram it all into one webinar, thought it would be better to focus this into 2, potentially 3. This one's going to be mainly foundational, going over the basics of rule sets, why they're set up the way they are, and just giving you a glimpse of that inner working of how it's set up, why it's set up the reason it is. So we go over creating input channels, creating and linking rule sets, using regular expressions to assign files to a specific project, and monitoring and troubleshooting rule evaluation. ES file input is split into 2 main components overall. The first is input channels, which are basically some method of ingesting files into ES. That can be as simple as the upload button in ES when you have ES open in a web browser. It can also represent other methods of file ingestion, such as maybe hot folders or files that are being sent into ES via email, or files that are being uploaded to an FTP server that your ES is configured to watch. Wherever those files are coming from, an input channel is just some method of receiving those files. Then from there, once you have those files, particularly if they're coming from a hot folder or an FTP or something other than the ES interface, the big trick is you to figure out how to associate those. Where are those files supposed to go in the system? And that's where rule sets come into play. Rule sets are a way of determining where a specific file is supposed to go, what specific customer and project, based off of the file name or the place it was uploaded or some other aspect of that file. That can be just something as simple as file name. It can be something as complex as even looking into where it was uploaded or what file type. But the main benefit of rule sets, and if you've used kind of the stock ES upload in the interface, you may not have played with this option before, but there are 3 main benefits to it. The first is it allows you to use hot folder based uploads because you need some way to map those to a specific customer and a specific project. Secondly, it can be used to enforce naming conventions, particularly in situations where you're relying on very strict naming conventions that need to be met. And third way, the reason is it allows you to have a little more flexibility over how those files are processed. In more advanced cases of rule sets, you can even use those to determine what workflow files are being run through, which point in the workflow they start in, or even just what metadata is available in the workflow itself. But we won't delve too much into that third point today. I think that'll come in a later webinar. So best place to get started here would be input channels. So those are located under the administrative area, IO input channels. So I'm going to go ahead and click on, I have one here I created as a demo for today called Webinar FTP. These input channels are comprised of 2 main components. First, an input pipe, 1 or more input pipes, which are locations that files are being input, and secondly, a linked rule set that tells it how to place those files into a project later on. You can have as many input pipes as you like, and there are different types as you can see listed here. So let me go in. The one here, I have one that's a hot folder input. And there's a few different criteria you can see in here. You can put a friendly description if you want to have a note of what that is for later on. The checkbox for active or inactive means that you can have things that are saved. Maybe you had a legacy server that you once had an input in your system for. Maybe you don't want to delete that in case you have to go back at some point. You can just deactivate it, and then if you need to come back to it later, click the check to make it active. The host field determines which server in your ES environment is going to be monitoring this particular hot folder and looking for file uploads. In my case, if you're using a single server install, like in my case, you're only going to have one option in that dropdown, so you can pretty safely ignore it. If you're in a multi-site ES installer, a distributed ES install where you've got a lot of different servers, such as different renders or eTwists or application servers, it'll have a whole drop-down. You choose which server is going to watch that folder so that you don't have multiple different servers fighting over that same file and trying to pick it up. That actually will be becoming more important in ES 5.5 with the introduction of sites. Because that way, if you have ES servers distributed, maybe you've got some in your central office in Chicago, but you've got a separate server down in Florida. You might want to, you've got maybe a separate eTwist down in Florida or a separate render in Florida that's near a hot folder where those files are being dropped. You might want something local to those files to pick them up. So that will be something coming in ES 5.5. You've got the path in here, and the last thing you've got in here is the check interval, which is the number of seconds ES waits between checking that folder for new file uploads. By default, I think that's set to 30 seconds, which is a pretty decent value. For the sake of timeliness in our webinar, so we're not waiting too long, I bumped that down to 10. That being said, if you do have a customer that tends to upload very large files in excess of maybe 50 or 100 megabytes, it would do you good to increase that value to maybe 1.5 minutes, so it has a little more time for those files to materialize in your hot folder. So that's one type. We're going to be using mainly hot folders today. Just to review a few of the other types that are available to you, the upload option in here is for uploads done through the ES interface in your web browser. If you select this, it gives you the option to take a specific customer. Maybe I want this guy to only to kind of be broken off from the normal evaluation that these uploads go through. I can single out this customer and say, I don't want to evaluate him through the default input channel and rule set that came with ES. I want to look at his file names my own way so I can make sure they conform to a more rigid naming standard. There is also FTP folder. The FTP watcher is the main one you'd be interested in here if you're doing anything with FTP. You can hook it up to another FTP server and have it pull in any files that are uploaded. The email watcher can be connected to an SMTP mail server and used to automatically ingest any files that were uploaded or via email to that email address. And lastly, file monitoring is mainly used for ES file systems. So we have our input pipes here, and you can define multiples, as I mentioned, and they're going to be evaluated through this rule set that I've linked down here. So let me go over to my rule set here. And you'll see I have 3 main rules in here, and these rules will all be evaluated. They're basically different ways of defining some kind of a naming convention that I'm comparing my file against to see whether it matches. So I have 3 different examples in here, and this is all done in order from top to bottom, so it uses a bit of a priority in there. So I have this first rule here will be evaluated first. It'll try and see if the file matches this rule and if it can assign that to a project using that rule. If not, it'll generally move on to the next rule, try that, and then lastly try this third rule before giving up and considering the file as not assigned. So we'll dig into this rule here. Immediately we'll see there's a few just kind of broad brush filters you can use in here to control what sort of work is accepted by this rule. First off, there's a filter criteria. Maybe I only want this rule to accept single page or multi-page documents. You can restrict those. So for example, if this was a rule designed to catch multi-page documents, it could be because it's routing them to a workflow that splits them into single pages later on, and you don't necessarily want a single page going into that workflow. There is a MIME area here. I have this set to check for all file types. If you uncheck that, there is a list down here, and I can say maybe I only want this rule to accept files that are JPEGs or PDFs or TIFFs. So you can lock down which types of files are allowed with this rule. The rule behavior area over here, this when filter criteria matches, for most cases, you're not going to have to specifically worry about this option. In 90% of cases, you're going to use this upload each document and revision in production structure option. And what that option is going to do is if it sees a project and a customer that match what it's pulling out of the file name, it will assign that file and process it into your project. The other options in here, just to gloss over them, some of these are mainly used behind the scenes for different rules that are kind of pre-baked with ES. The first one here, try assigning to production structure. I think that's typically if you have a existing copy of a file in the system that'll allow you to upload a revision. Upload each document as file not assigned typically just pushes things to it counts it as a not a match. And so if there's a certain type of file that you want to restrict from coming into ES, you can build a rule where it looks for a certain file naming convention and then rejects it because it knows it's a type of file that you don't want to pick up. Upload each revision as file not assigned will allow new documents to come into the system, but won't allow you to add additional revisions on top of it. And lastly, the use next rule will skip and just move on to the next rule if you get a match. So maybe you have a situation where you're trying to get a little more clarity based off a specific file name, so you don't want it to quite match yet, but you want it to skip on further in the workflow. When filter criteria does not match, handles basically what happens if this rule doesn't match, what does it do? And the most common behavior here is next rule. You can also use the stop option here to have it stop evaluating this rule and this whole rule set and just kind of consider the file not assigned. Over in the production structure tab here is where you actually do the mapping out of which parts of the file name or upload area correspond to which customer and project. This is done through the use of regular expressions. I have a regular expression here and I have a sample file name here. I have some of these files we'll be uploading to ES in a little bit and we can see how this parses out. But basically, I have these parentheses to mark out different atoms in my regular expression that are going to correspond to parts of my file name. And this is a bit of a ham-fisted example here. It's very forced, but if you want an example of what very, very rudimentary rules that looks like, this is it. I have file names where they're following a very rigid naming convention where there is a customer code followed by an underscore, followed by the project name, followed by 2 underscores, followed by the actual real file name. If I click test here, it shows me what each of these atoms is pulling out of the file name based on the regular expression I defined here. So you can see this first atom, it pulled out demo, which is my customer code. The second atom here pulled out the project name, which is webinar 2. And the third atom here pulled out the actual file name, demo mailer r2.pdf. Down here, I can then take those atoms and use those to determine different parts of the file assignment. So for example, here you can choose from, there's some different options in here. Some of the ones with ID are typically used by ES under the hood. The main ones I tend to like to use if I'm pulling something in through a hot folder is customer code, because customer code is basically just the short name you give a customer, like sort of a short abbreviation of the customer name. There is also I believe there is a customer name option here you can choose as well if you want to use the actual full customer name. But I'm using this option and then I'm saying I want to use this number 1 atom and map that first bit it's pulling out of the file name as my customer code when I try and assign this if it matches. I'm pulling the second atom and using that as my project name. And then I'm using the third atom as the document name, because in this case, I don't want all this extra information once my file's been uploaded. I just want to push it in and then just take the actual real useful file name and truncate the rest off the front. So that's my rule. If I go over to, let me actually pull up my FTP client here. I am FTP'd into my ES server. I am in my hot folder. And I'm going to dump in maybe 2 of these files. We'll go over here to my project. And it'll take a few seconds, but those should be coming in fairly soon. So you can see those files were pulled in from the hot folder, and they were pulled into my Webinar 1 project. The one other thing that's really useful about using hot folders for uploads with these rule sets is that you can also create projects that don't yet exist in the system. So for example, here I have one of these with the Debo Webinar 2 project. And if I upload this file, it's going to create a new Webinar 2 project in here because I have it set to assign a file if it recognizes the production structure that it belongs to. It's important to note that you can't create customers on the fly that way because customers themselves require manual setup. You have to define what project template they have, any users, all the just general high-level setup. For a project, ES already knows what basic template you use for a project because you have a project template assigned with your customer or associated with your customer. So it'll just create a new project with that name using that template. And you can see my file came in the same way here and it created my new project. One of the areas where this can be incredibly handy is, let's say you have an input channel that's directed to watch a customer's FTP. And you know that the customer is regularly going to FTP in files according to a certain naming convention that clearly states what issue that file is a part of. You can have ES as soon as those files are ingested, rather than someone having to come into ES and manually create that project before they can upload. It would pull in those FTP uploads, create the project, and then perhaps maybe even as part of your project, fire off an email to your customer service team letting them know that the customer has initiated this new project. So you lose a few steps of manual labor in there and can more easily initiate that project creation process. But you don't always have to use, just because you can pull information out of these file names doesn't mean you have to. I have one example in here where I know if files come in with this naming convention, I know they belong to this demo corp customer. So I didn't have to use anything pulled out of the name in this case. I could just hard code it because I know it belongs to this customer. The other thing I'm doing in here is this particular customer, they're uploading a file and it has the name of the issue, which is always a PO, the letters PO followed by any number of digits. In this particular case, if I were to upload, I have 3 files in here with wildly different naming conventions. The one similarity is they all have an instance where PO is followed by 1 or more digits. So I'll go ahead and upload those. And in this case, it's automatically going to assign to Demo Corp, even though the customer name isn't in my file name. And it's also going to keep the file name whole this time. I put all 3 of my atoms together for this, so I'm not truncating the file name at all here. If we pop over here, we'll see those were already created. So those 2 projects went in, files went in there, and this 3rd file with the really ridiculous name here even managed to make it to its correct project over here. I will say, just as an example, because I'm seeing there are a few people on the call who are pretty familiar with this sort of stuff we're going over. As one sort of advanced tip here, this is a very literal regular expression here because we're pulling out each of those 3 components, and then I'm manually relinking those back here to define the document name. There is a simpler way to do this that previously wasn't available in Twist. But if I go in here and let's say instead of, what I can actually do is, instead of mapping it out that way, actually get rid of this paren here. I'll get rid of this guy here. And you'll see here you can have nested atoms within your regular expression. So here I have this first set of atoms that goes the whole parentheses that goes around the whole name, and that's grabbing the entire file name. But I have a second atom in here that is specifically grabbing just my PO number or my project name, so that you don't have to type the 1, 2, 3 in here. In this case, you would just have the project name be mapped to number 2 and have the document name be mapped to just number 1, which is a little simpler to maintain further on down the road. And you don't even have to pull information. There are other ways of getting that information that don't rely on it being in the file name. One second example here is I have this second one here, which is looking for folders, subfolders within my hot folder. In this particular case, with this regular expression, with the dot pluses, it's looking for an absolute folder name there. So in this case, I'm looking for, within my hot folder, one directory, and then another directory within that that contains my file. And in this case, I'm mapping those values out to, first off, my customer code, and second, my project name, and then lastly, the document name is going to be the document name. So if I go here, I have a folder I made as an example, Demo Webinar 3. And if I were to dump in just any odd files here, it's going to look at those first two atoms, are going to look at the folder name and this other subfolder name and use those to assign it to a customer and project. So we should see those trickling in here. Yep, and it just got created. So one more example for you there. And this is all being handled according to that order of operations here. And I sort of organize these deliberately from the most specific to the most vague sort of way, which is generally a good practice to get into because of that order of operations in these rule sets. You can control how these are analyzed and actually build catch-all rules. So in this case, for example, I know if I have a very rigid naming convention with both the customer name and the project name in it, I'm going to run with that. If I don't have that, then I'm going to go with the second one where it looks at the folder it's uploaded into. For example, in this particular case, if I were to upload a folder into this subfolder that had the customer and project name in it, it wouldn't even get to this step. It would use the most precise information it had before going on to a more vague sort of second step. Then this third option here, if neither of those match, it would look for something with a PO number. Because in this case, maybe if it has a PO number in the name, maybe it's a mistake. If it still explicitly spells out this customer and project name, or it is pushed into those folders, it'll use what it considers, in my example's case, more specific information. So there are benefits. All these examples are based off of hot folder uploads. But there are cases where it can be beneficial to use these sort of rules with files uploaded through the ES interface. For example, if you go into a project and click this upload button. And the regular expressions you use for those sort of rules do by nature have to be slightly different. So as an example here, I created a Webinar Forms Inc. input channel. You can see here it's set to the upload type, and it's supposed to upload files to the Forms Inc. customer. Now, and that is linked up to the Forms Inc. rule set here. So if I go to that rule set, I mainly did a copy from the default upload rule set that ES uses automatically, and I just tweaked a few things because this specific customer in this specific example has pages that need to run through different workflows. In this particular case, it would be pages that are ads and editorial pages. Maybe this is a magazine, and the ad pages need to be subjected to a different review process than editorial pages do. You can use a rule set to redirect those to different workflows. As an example of that, let me double click on one of these guys. This is my edit upload rule. And you'll see here right away, I have all these .star regular expressions, these atoms, for 3 different folders before my file name. And that's because anything that gets uploaded into the ES system gets uploaded according to through the ES interface, gets uploaded according to a pretty rigid structure that the ES backend then uses to know where it's assigned. And it usually corresponds to, the first is always the year. So we go to the default rule here, that probably shows it a little better. When you upload a file through the ES interface, it gets stashed temporarily in a folder named for the year, the project template ID, the project number, and then the file name. So anything that comes from a hot folder, you're kind of building your own structure there, but anything that's coming through the ES interface is going to conform with these first three atoms here. And typically the easiest way to get those in the system is to keep those and just change this fourth one for the file name as needed. So for example, here I have one for add content. It's looking for any file that has the letters AD in uppercase in the name. And it's going to take those and it's going to assign them accordingly, but it's also going to push them through this workflow webinar add. And I have a second corresponding one for editorial content here. It's going to push files through webinar edit. If you don't want to choose a specific workflow, typically you would just choose as a generic workflow option in here, which will use whatever the default workflow is for your project. But here we're going to go with those two specific workflows. So if I go over to my customer here, let me just upload, I think I got a few pages here that have add or editorial designations, and we'll push those into the system. You'll see those files are coming in, so they are going to different workflows for workflow add and for webinar edit. We've got two workflows here. They actually add different approval steps here even within these workflows. So you can see how this could be used to further control how files are processed down the line. If different file types need to be processed differently or different naming conventions reflect that files need a different type of handling later on down the line. So that's about the gist of building input channels and linking them to rule sets. The trick would be, what happens if you have a file that doesn't match the naming convention? So maybe I upload, let me refresh so I don't see all these old files in here. The first thing that's going to happen, that's a big telltale sign, let me show hidden files in here. There is a hidden .moved folder within every ES hot folder that you make. So for example, let me upload, I'll just give this some random name and mash some keys here. Won't put a semicolon in because that's no good. But I'll upload a file here that is not going to match any of my rules whatsoever. And you'll see as soon as I do that, in another, keep refreshing here, that will wind up getting copied into this .moved folder. And that's sort of a storage location where ES holds that file while it determines what it wants to do with it. And if I go into Registered Files, you'll see this is an area where you can search and see which files had what outcome. So if I go into, right now I'm looking at all input channels, files that were not assigned. So if I go to, you can filter that further if I want to go to just, for example, Webinar Forms Inc. Or we'll go with Webinar FTP, I think is what I just used. It'll tell you that the file doesn't match any naming convention over here. There's a little warning. It shows me all the info about where it was uploaded, which server, which input channel. If the big help in here is there is this log button. And what it'll do is show you a log, and it shows you for each rule, it lets you know which rule set it's going through. And it shows you each rule that it's tried to evaluate against in order. So it looked first at this main rule I had at the top of my rule set, so that this file name up here did not match that, so it moved on to the next rule. Tried that, didn't match, and then it went on to the third, tried that, and because it matched none of those, it considered it unassignable and just hung it out here as a warning in registered files. You can also check those for files that were assigned So for example, something like this purchase order one, you'll see it didn't match that first regular expression, so it ignored that. The second regular expression didn't match, so it ignored that. But this third one down here, it found one, so it went ahead and created a page and pushed that into a project. So that's one thing that can be helpful too if you're in a situation where maybe you don't recognize why a file is being picked up for a certain rule. You can use this to help troubleshoot. And in the case where you have files that aren't getting assigned, you can even do a direct assignment here, and there's a window you can bring up to say, I want to push this into a specific customer with a project name and do a manual assignment. And typically you'll tell, one case where that can commonly happen is if I go into my rule set here, there's an option in here that says allows input file if before step. And you can select a step that might be in your workflow. So for example, approval whiffle. So in this case, if I had this set up like this, and I'm running through a standard approval workflow, the file will be input into ES. It'll allow it in as a revision. If it's a new file, it'll let it in. If it's a revision, it'll check whether there's already an existing file and what step it's at. And if it's before approval whiffle, it would let me upload that revision. If it's past that step, it won't. And one of the things you'll see in that case, I think I might have a good example I can show real quick here, is you'll get a little icon that tells you, a little badge that tells you that files have been uploaded that couldn't be placed. So I'll create a new project here. I'll upload this guy. And I think this guy's set up so he won't allow revisions, but if not, we can tweak him so he is. Yep, this one's set up so that it won't allow revisions if the work is run through the workflow. And you'll see we got this one here in this red badge. And if I were to upload more files, you would see that as a counter. And that tells you that a file has been uploaded, but it couldn't place it because it was past the step where this particular slot was accepting revisions. And if you click on that, I might not actually like my browser, but typically you might have to try it in Chrome later, but I believe there's a way you can click that and it'll bring up that direct assignment palette there so you can decide what you want that file, where you want that file to go. So one other thing you can check is one common issue we've seen too, particularly in distributed installs, is if you run into a circumstance where your files aren't being picked up, but they're not showing in registered files down here. So your files are disappearing from your hot folder, but they're not actually showing up in here as unregistered. And that typically happens when there's an issue with the devices in a distributed install that are not communicating with each other correctly. And typically, the easiest way to solve that is if you're in a situation where that's happening, you can navigate to whichever device is causing the problem, which would be usually the device that's set to watch that hot folder, and just hitting this resend subscriptions button here and clicking yes. After that, it should allow you to upload those files. So one other note of caution here too from a troubleshooting perspective is this .moved folder. It's very important that you don't delete that folder if you're having problems. If you're trying to get rid of some of the files in there, the preferred method of doing it is through registered files in the ES interface. I can click these guys and I can click delete if I don't want them in here anymore. And it should, after maybe I think like a minute or two, it'll wind up clearing those files out of my moved folder. The issue, if you delete the .moved folder, I've seen cases where that can stop the input channel and temporarily disable it, or where the bigger problem comes with is if, depending on the permissions of the mount where you're creating that hot folder, there's some cases where ES isn't able to, or doesn't have permission to create a new .moved folder to replace the one that you deleted. So that can stall all uploads as well. So typically the two rules there: don't delete the .moved folders if you see them, and if you need to delete files in there to clear up space, do it through the ES interface by finding your not assigned files for your input channel and clicking delete. So lastly, I know we're running short on time, but just as far as best practices, just to kind of tie all this together, I would say a few of mine would be, first, beware of the defaults. By default, ES uses, there is a rule set, an upload channel called main, and there is a rule set called upload. And if you've never really played around with rule sets before, this is the one that's used for evaluating all files that are uploaded to ES. And typically it's not too hard. If you want to add one of your own rules in here, you can modify, maybe copy one, clicking the duplicate button, and add extra rules. The one caveat there is sometimes when you're updating ES and doing a major version update, so maybe you're going from ES4 to ES5 or ES5 to the upcoming ES5.5, there will be different features introduced for something within ES, so maybe something with the rule set, for example. In those cases, when you're doing the install, ES will tend to copy in a new version of this default, of its default elements that have been changed, so that they take advantage of all the new features in the product. So in this particular case, if they made a change in the future to the upload rule set, there might be a case where it pushes in a new copy of that default, and you wind up losing your custom rule after the update. So typically what I prefer to do in those cases is build my own separate rule sets. It's pretty easy to, if you create a new one, it's pretty easy to make a copy from another rule set and use all the rules from the default and bring them over to your own. If you don't want to do that and you prefer to work in that upload, I would just take an export of that before performing any update, just so you don't permanently risk losing those rules in the off chance that an update pushes in a new copy of that default. Second best practice would be to build fewer but more flexible rules. One example would be the rule that I was showing earlier for subfolders here. You could have a situation where maybe you have a naming convention or an FTP site somewhere that you have subfolders on there that all your different customers are uploading to. Rather than creating individual rules that are hard-coded with, for example, the customer name or the customer code, you could push your input channel to look one kind of directory up on your file system and use the regular expression to pull in that customer code. Because that way, maybe you can save having 10 individual rules with hard-coded elements by having one rule that's a little more complex, but a little more flexible, that handles all those cases, because that becomes a lot easier to manage further on down the road. One third one would be based off that actually is if you could create catch-all rules. Because of the order of operations in here, you can handle the most specific cases up front, as I mentioned. But rather than having files go to files not assigned, sometimes based off what you know, maybe you can glean that at least it's coming from a specific customer. You can build catch-all, so maybe it gets pushed into a specific project for unassigned files. It could be temporarily uploaded there and run through a workflow that emails someone to let them know that a file didn't place correctly. You can use those rules to your advantage to handle files a little more smoothly, particularly for hot folder uploads. And the last one would be beware of overly rigid rules. It is possible if you're building a input channel that watches all uploads for a specific customer, you can enforce it so that all files coming in have to be named a certain way. So they have to maybe have a customer code or a PO number and a bunch of other stuff in there because you want to make sure those files are named correctly. But if the rule set they're going to is extremely rigid, there's a chance that nothing that customer uploads will go to the project they expect it to. So for example, if I'm in this, maybe I'm in a project like this, I click upload, I expect my file to go to the project I'm currently in. But if my rule set's configured really rigidly and it's looking specifically for the project name in a file, maybe it picks up something that looks like a project name and pushes it somewhere else. So that's one other thing I like to keep sometimes, those rules separate for files uploaded via hot folder and via the ES interface. But I think that's a good primer. I think we'll dig maybe, I'm thinking not next few months because we got a few other webinars in the pipeline, but I'm thinking we'll do a part 2, maybe early 2018, that delves into some of the more advanced features of rule sets. But with that, does anyone have any questions? I'm not seeing any in here right now. You guys are a quiet bunch today. So
I think we have a well-informed group today. We
I think
got
we
no
do.
questions.
Yep. Well, I want to thank you all for attending. Keep an eye out. Hopefully we should have information on the October webinar soon. Thank you and have a good day.